This outline captures the emotional depth, the themes of trust, loyalty, and coexistence with nature, and the transformative journey of the Thompson family. Let me know if you want to expand on any chapter or if you need any adjustments. The wind howled through the towering pines surrounding the Thompson cabin, carrying with it the sharp bite of an early winter evening. Inside, the air was warm and heavy with the scent of pine wood burning in the fireplace. Emma Thompson curled up on the worn leather couch, her fingers absent-mindedly twisting a strand of her chestnut hair as she flipped through a well-loved book. Outside, darkness settled swiftly, swallowing the forest in shadow. It was the kind of night that made the world feel smaller, cozier, as if nothing could intrude on the sanctuary they had built deep in the woods. Her father, Michael, sat nearby, adjusting the flame on an antique oil lamp that flickered uncertainly against the darkened windows. "Looks like a cold one tonight," he muttered, glancing outside where snow had begun to fall in feathery flurries, dusting the ground in white. Emma nodded, her eyes drifting to the window. She always loved the way snow transformed the familiar landscape into something magical. Her mother, Sarah, was in the kitchen, humming softly as she stirred a pot of stew on the old iron stove. It was one of those rare evenings where everything felt perfectly still, perfectly right. A sharp knock shattered the tranquility. It was faint, barely audible over the crackling fire and the low hum of the wind, but it was unmistakable. Emma's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, glancing at her father. Michael looked up from the lamp, his brow furrowing. "Probably just the wind," he said, though his voice held an edge of uncertainty. But then it came again, a soft, rhythmic thudding, like someone weakly tapping at the door. The sound was fragile, almost pleading. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. "Dad!" she began, but Michael was already on his feet, moving toward the door with cautious strides. He grabbed the heavy flashlight from the mantel and motioned for Emma to stay back, but she couldn't resist inching closer, her curiosity outweighing her fear. Michael hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the latch before he swung the door open, letting in a gust of icy wind that sent shivers through the room. The porch light flickered, its faint glow illuminating a scene that would forever change their lives. A massive figure lay sprawled across the snow-dusted porch, its body heaving with labored breaths. At first, Emma thought it was a shadow, a trick of the dim light, but then she saw the glistening fur, matted with dirt and blood, the enormous paws trembling as they struggled to hold on. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what it was. A bear, but not just any bear. This was a mother, her body curled protectively around a small, shivering bundle. A cub, no larger than a puppy, its eyes wide with terror, pressed against its mother's side, its tiny frame quaking from the cold. Michael took a cautious step back, his hand instinctively shielding Emma. "Get inside, Emma," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. But Emma was frozen in place, her eyes locked on the bear's face. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. The mother bear's eyes were half-lidded, glazed with pain, but within them was a haunting gentleness, a silent plea for help. Emma's heart ached as she watched the bear struggle to breathe, her body shuddering with each painful gasp. Blood stained the snow beneath her, vivid against the stark white. Whatever had attacked her had been merciless. Then Emma saw him. Standing just behind the fallen bear, his golden fur blending into the snow, was a dog. A golden retriever, his body poised protectively between the bear and the dark woods beyond. His eyes locked onto Emma's, filled with an emotion so raw and so human it took her breath away. It was fear, but not for himself. His gaze shifted to the cub, his body lowering as he took a cautious step closer, his head bent low, almost pleading. The dog was guarding the cub, protecting it. Michael's voice broke the spell. "Emma, now!" he barked, his eyes never leaving the dog. Reluctantly, she stumbled backward into the house, her heart pounding as Michael shut the door, the lock clicking into place. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "A mother bear," Michael answered, his face pale. "And she's dying." Emma felt tears sting her eyes. She had seen animals hurt before, Living in the woods meant coming face to face with the harshness of nature. But this was different. There was something almost sacred about the way the bear lay, shielding her cub even in her final moments. In the dog, Emma couldn't shake the look in his eyes, the way he stood his ground, determined and loyal. Sarah appeared from the kitchen, her face creased with worry. "Michael, what's going on?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. He hesitated, glancing at Emma before speaking. "A bear collapsed on our porch. She's badly injured, and she has a cub." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. "A cub? Here? And a dog?" Emma added softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her parents turned to her, confusion etched across their faces. "A golden retriever," she explained. "He was protecting the cub. He looked so scared." For a moment, silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. Then Michael spoke, his voice steady and calm. "We need to call Dr. Harris. If there's any chance to save her." He trailed off, his eyes darkening. "We owe it to her to try." Emma's heart swelled with hope, but fear gnawed at her too. Would they be too late? Would the bear survive long enough to say goodbye to her cub? And what about the dog? Who was he, and why had he stayed by the bear's side? As Michael picked up the phone to call the vet, Emma moved to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she peered outside. The dog hadn't moved. He stood vigil beside the mother bear, his body tense and alert, his eyes flicking from the cabin to the cub, as if daring the darkness to come closer. The snow continued to fall, soft and relentless, wrapping the world in silence. But beneath that blanket of white, life and death danced precariously on the edge, waiting for the dawn. Emma pressed her hand to the cold glass, her heart whispering a silent promise to the mother bear outside. "Hold on. We're here. We'll help you. Just hold on." The air inside the Thompson cabin was heavy with tension, each second ticking by in agonizing slowness. Emma stood by the window, her breath forming small circles of fog on the glass as she watched the snow continue to fall. Outside, the golden retriever hadn't moved, his body a silent sentinel beside the dying bear. Emma's heart twisted as she took in the scene. The mother bear's massive form curled protectively around her cub, her breaths shallow and uneven. The cub whimpered, pressing against its mother's side, seeking warmth and comfort from a body that was rapidly growing cold. The dog's eyes never left the cub, his posture protective, his expression desperate. Behind her, she heard her father's voice, low and urgent as he spoke to the vet. "Yes, Dr. Harris. It's a bear. She's badly wounded. Yes, there's a cub and a dog, a golden retriever. He's guarding the cub like it's his own. I understand. Please hurry." Michael hung up, his shoulders sagging as he turned to his wife. "Dr. Harris is on his way, but the roads are getting worse. He said it could take an hour or more." Sarah's face tightened with worry, her hand instinctively reaching for her locket, a nervous habit she'd had for as long as Emma could remember. "Michael, if that bear doesn't make it, what happens to the cub?" Her voice wavered, and Emma's chest tightened. She hadn't thought about that. If the mother bear died, the cub would be orphaned, left to fend for itself in a world it was far too young to understand. Her father's expression grew grim. Without its mother, it won't survive. Cubs that young, they need protection, warmth, nourishment. Alone, it doesn't stand a chance. A cold shiver ran down Emma's spine, and she turned back to the window, her eyes fixated on the tiny creature huddled in the snow. It looked so fragile, so impossibly small beside its massive mother. And yet, there was a spark of life in its movements, a will to survive that defied its helplessness. Emma's gaze drifted to the dog, his golden fur flecked with snow, his body trembling from the cold. But he didn't leave. He stayed, his head bowed low, his eyes never leaving the cub. "He's protecting it," Emma whispered, her voice breaking. "That dog, he won't leave the cub's side." Her parents joined her at the window, their faces etched with a mixture of awe and sorrow. "He must have been with them for a while," Michael murmured, his eyes narrowing as he studied the scene. "Look at how close they are. It's like he's part of their family." Sarah's fingers tightened around her locket, her voice soft with wonder. Maybe he's been caring for them, keeping the cub safe while the mother was too weak to protect it. Emma's heart fluttered at the thought. A wild dog living with a bear and her cub, guarding them, protecting them. It sounded like something out of a storybook. But as she watched the golden retriever nudge the cub closer to its mother, his movements gentle and deliberate, she realized it was the only explanation that made sense. This dog, whoever he was, had chosen to stay. Chosen to protect a cub that wasn't his, out of loyalty or love, or maybe just a sense of duty. And he wasn't going to leave, even as the snow continued to fall, even as the night grew colder. Emma couldn't bear it anymore. She turned to her father, her eyes pleading. "We have to help them. We can't just watch them die." Michael's jaw tightened, his gaze flicking from Emma to the scene outside. "It's dangerous, Emma. That bear is wild. Even injured, she could be deadly. And the dog, we don't know how he'll react if we get too close." But Emma shook her head, her voice rising with desperation. "She's dying, Dad. Look at her. She can barely breathe. She's not going to hurt us. And the dog, he's protecting the cub. He's not going to attack us if we're helping them." Michael hesitated, his eyes searching his daughter's face. He saw the determination there, the compassion that had always been her strength, even when she was little. Emma had never been able to walk away from a creature in need. And now, looking at her, Michael knew she was right. They couldn't just stand by and watch. "All right," he said finally, his voice firm. "But we do this carefully, slowly. I'll go out first, alone. If the dog lets me get close, then you and Mom can bring out some blankets." He turned to his wife, who nodded, her eyes filled with worry, but also with resolve. "We'll do this together." Emma's heart leapt with hope as she watched her father pull on his heavy coat and boots, grabbing a thick blanket before heading to the door. "Be careful, Michael," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I will," he promised, his eyes lingering on his family before he stepped outside, the cold air rushing in before the door closed behind him. Emma pressed her face to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched her father approach the animals. He moved slowly, his hands visible, his posture relaxed. The golden retriever stiffened, his body lowering protectively over the cub as he watched Michael draw closer. Emma held her breath, her heart pounding. If the dog attacked, but he didn't. He stayed still, his eyes wary but not hostile. Michael stopped a few feet away, lowering himself to one knee, his movements deliberate, non-threatening. He spoke softly, his voice low and soothing, though Emma couldn't make out the words. The dog's ears twitched, his body trembling, but he didn't move. Instead, he looked back at the cub, his eyes flicking between the tiny creature and the man who had come to help. Then slowly the dog stepped back, his body lowering to the ground, his head resting on his paws. It was a gesture of trust, of surrender. He was letting them help. Emma's heart swelled with relief, tears prickling her eyes. "He understands," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "He knows we're trying to help." Sarah hugged her tightly, her own eyes shining with tears. "That's no ordinary dog," she murmured, her voice breaking. "He's special. I can feel it." Emma nodded, her gaze never leaving the window. She watched as her father carefully wrapped the cub in the blanket, his hands gentle, his movements slow and steady. The mother bear's body shuddered, a low, mournful sound escaping her lips. It was a sound of pain, of fear, of farewell. And as the dog lifted his head, his eyes reflecting the golden glow of the porch light, Emma saw the truth. He wasn't just a guardian, he was family. Snow swirled around Michael as he gently lifted the tiny cub, its body shivering beneath a thick woolen blanket. The cub let out a pitiful whimper, its eyes wide with fear as it instinctively wriggled, searching for the warmth of its mother. Michael's heart clenched as he glanced down at the mother bear, lying motionless on the snow-covered porch. Her breathing was shallow, ragged, each breath seeming to take more effort than the last. Her massive body was curled protectively, even in her weakness, as if trying to shield her baby from the cold and darkness encroaching around them. Kneeling beside her, Michael placed a gloved hand on her shoulder, feeling the faint rise and fall beneath his palm. "Easy now," he murmured softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We're going to help you." The golden retriever watched every movement with intense, unwavering eyes. His body was low to the ground, his head resting on his paws, but his muscles were taut, ready to spring if he sensed danger. There was something painfully human in his expression, a pleading look that went beyond words, a silent appeal for mercy, for compassion. Michael kept his movements slow, deliberate, speaking in low, soothing tones as he wrapped the cub securely in the blanket, tucking the edges close to retain its warmth. The cub nuzzled against his chest, its tiny body trembling, but it seemed to calm under his gentle touch. "You're safe now," he whispered, his breath clouding in the icy air. "We've got you." The mother bear let out a low, shuddering groan, her head shifting just enough for Michael to see her eyes. They were glassy with pain, but her gaze was clear, focused. She looked at him, then at the cub cradled in his arms, her eyes softening with something that looked like relief. Michael's throat tightened, emotion swelling in his chest. She understood. Somehow she knew that he was trying to help, that he wasn't a threat. Her eyes flicked toward the golden retriever, and a look passed between them, an unspoken understanding, a final wish. The dog rose slowly, his body moving with the stiffness of exhaustion and cold, but his eyes were bright, determined. He walked to the mother bear's side, pressing his nose against her cheek, a soft whine escaping his throat. It was a sound so full of sorrow that it sent chills down Michael's spine. The bear responded with a weak nuzzle, a gesture of love, of gratitude. Then she looked at her cub one last time, a soft huff of breath escaping her lips, a sound that was almost a sigh. Her body shuddered once, her eyes drifting shut as she exhaled her final breath. The world went silent. Even the wind seemed to hush, the snow falling softly around them like a curtain of white. Michael felt a lump form in his throat, his eyes burning as he watched the bear's body fall still, her immense form finally at peace. She looked almost serene, as if she had been waiting, fighting to hold on just long enough to know her cub was safe. And now that she knew, she could let go. The golden retriever threw his head back, a mournful howl piercing the night air, the sound echoing through the trees. It was a cry of anguish, of grief so raw that it made Michael's chest ache. The dog's body trembled, his eyes glistening with unshed tears as he pressed his nose into the bear's fur, refusing to leave her side. Michael swallowed hard, his arms tightening around the cub, who let out a tiny whimper, its body curling against his chest as if seeking comfort from the pain it didn't understand. "Michael?" The voice was soft, trembling. He turned to see Emma standing on the porch, her face pale, her eyes wide with tears. Sarah was behind her, one hand covering her mouth, her shoulders shaking as she tried to hold back sobs. Michael took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay steady for their sake. "She's gone," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. She held on as long as she could." Emma's lip quivered, her eyes drifting to the golden retriever, who lay pressed against the mother bear's side, his body curved protectively around her, even in death. "He loved her," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He was with her, to the very end." Michael nodded, unable to find words. There was a purity in the dog's grief that was almost sacred, a loyalty so fierce and unwavering that it broke his heart. He stepped closer to Emma, his free arm wrapping around her shoulders as she buried her face against him, her body shaking with silent sobs. The cub stirred in his arms, its tiny paws reaching blindly, its head lifting with a weak, pitiful cry. At the sound, the golden retriever's head snapped up, his ears perking as his eyes locked onto the cub. He stood slowly, his body swaying with exhaustion, but his gaze was sharp, focused. He took a step forward, his tail low, his movements hesitant. Michael held his breath as the dog approached, his nose twitching as he sniffed the bundle cradled in Michael's arms. The dog's eyes softened, his body relaxing as he recognized the cub's scent. A low whine escaped his throat, and he nuzzled the cub through the blanket, his tongue flicking out to lick its face. The cub let out a weak whimper, its tiny head leaning into the touch, and the dog's tail gave a tentative wag. "He thinks it's his," Emma whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. He wants to take care of it." Michael looked at the dog, his heart aching at the tenderness in his eyes. It was more than protection. It was love. Pure, selfless love. This dog had been by the mother bear's side, guarding her, protecting her cub. And even now in his grief, he was willing to carry on that duty. Michael took a deep breath, his decision solidifying as he looked at the cub, then at the dog. "Then we'll help him," he said firmly, his voice steady. "We'll help him protect her cub." The dog looked up at him, his eyes filled with gratitude, his tail wagging just a little faster. Michael smiled, the knot in his chest loosening as he saw hope flicker in the dog's gaze. "Come on, boy," he whispered, turning toward the cabin. "Let's get you both out of the cold." The golden retriever followed without hesitation, his body pressed close to Michael's leg as they stepped onto the porch. And as the door swung shut, sealing out the cold and darkness, Emma could have sworn she saw the dog's eyes shine with tears. But maybe it was just the light, reflecting the warmth and love that was waiting inside. Inside the Thompson cabin, the air was warm and heavy with emotion. The fire crackled softly, casting golden light across the room, illuminating the faces of the family as they gathered around the small, shivering cub, nestled in a nest of blankets near the hearth. The golden retriever lay close by, his body curled protectively around the cub, his golden fur blending with the soft woolen fabric. His eyes were half closed, his head resting on his paws, but his ears remained alert, twitching at every tiny sound the cub made. It was as if his very soul was anchored to the little creature, his entire being devoted to keeping it safe. Emma sat cross-legged beside them, her fingers gently stroking the dog's head, her touch light and soothing. She could feel his body trembling beneath her hand, not from fear, but from exhaustion. How long had he been out there, guarding the cub? How long had he fought against the cold and the darkness, refusing to abandon his post even as the mother bear grew weaker and weaker? The thought brought tears to her eyes and she leaned closer, her voice soft and tender. "You did so good, boy," she whispered, her breath warm against his fur. "You stayed with her. You stayed with both of them. You're a hero." The dog's tail thumped weakly against the floor, his eyes lifting to meet hers. In them, Emma saw a depth of emotion she could scarcely comprehend. Grief, loyalty, love. It took her breath away, that look. It was as if he was carrying the weight of the world in his heart, a burden he bore without complaint, without expectation of reward. Her chest tightened and she leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "It's okay," she murmured. "You're not alone anymore. We're going to help you. We're going to help both of you." Michael cleared his throat, his voice rough as he knelt beside Emma, his eyes focused on the cub. "He hasn't stopped watching her," he said softly, his gaze shifting to the golden retriever. "Even now, he's still protecting her." There was awe in his voice, a deep respect for the courage and loyalty this dog had shown. Michael reached out, his hand brushing lightly over the cub's tiny head, his fingers trembling as he felt the fragile life beneath his touch. "She's so small," he whispered, his eyes misting with tears. "So helpless. If he hadn't stayed, if he hadn't kept her warm..." His voice broke and he turned away, his shoulders shaking as he struggled to compose himself. Sarah placed a hand on his back, her own eyes wet with tears. "He saved her life," she said, her voice trembling. "He saved her because he couldn't bear to leave her. Even when her voice faltered and she looked away, her fingers tightening around her locket. Even when she was dying, he stayed." Emma watched her parents, her heart aching with love and sorrow. They were seeing it too, the bond between the dog and the cub, the unbreakable thread of loyalty that had kept them alive. It was more than protection. It was devotion. It was family. The cub stirred, its tiny body squirming beneath the blanket, its eyes blinking open as it let out a soft, pitiful cry. Immediately, the dog lifted his head, his body shifting as he moved closer, his nose nuzzling the cub with tender urgency. The cub whimpered, its paws reaching out, clinging to the dog's fur as it burrowed closer, its trembling body finding warmth and comfort in his presence. The golden retriever let out a low, soothing whine, his tongue flicking out to lick the cub's face, his eyes soft with love. Emma felt tears spill over, her chest tightening as she watched the scene unfold. "She thinks he's her mother," she whispered, her voice shaking. She thinks he's all she has." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, a sob escaping her lips. "Oh God," she choked, her eyes wide with pain. "She doesn't know. She doesn't understand." Michael wrapped an arm around his wife, his face pale as he held her close. "No," he murmured, his voice hollow. "She'll never know. And maybe that's a mercy." They watched in silence as the cub nuzzled deeper into the dog's fur, her tiny body finally relaxing, her breathing slowing as she drifted into a fitful sleep. The dog's eyes remained open, vigilant, his head resting lightly on the cub's back as his body curled around her, shielding her from the world. Emma reached out, her fingers stroking his fur. "She needs a name," she said quietly, her eyes never leaving the sleeping cub. "We can't just keep calling her the cub. She deserves more than that." Her parents exchanged a glance, their faces softening as they looked at their daughter, at the light in her eyes, the hope in her voice. "What do you want to call her?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle. Emma hesitated, her mind racing through possibilities. Names that were sweet, delicate, beautiful. But none of them felt right. None of them captured the strength she saw in this tiny creature, the will to survive that had kept her alive against all odds. And then, as she looked at the golden retriever curled around his precious charge, the answer came to her, clear and certain. "Willow," she whispered, her lips curving into a soft smile. "Her name is Willow." Michael's eyebrows lifted, his eyes searching her face. "Why Willow?" Emma's smile grew, her gaze fixed on the cub, on the way she clung to the dog, her body so small yet so determined. "Because willow trees bend but don't break," she explained, her voice steady. "They're strong, even when they look fragile. They survive the storms, no matter how hard the wind blows." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, her hand reaching out to brush a stray curl from Emma's cheek. "Willow," she repeated softly, the name rolling off her tongue like a promise. "It's perfect." The golden retriever's ears perked, his eyes lifting to meet Emma's as she spoke the name, his body shifting as if he understood. His tail thumped once against the floor, a soft wag of approval, his gaze warming as he looked down at the sleeping cub, his little Willow. Emma's heart swelled, love flooding her chest as she watched the dog curl even closer around Willow, his body a shield of warmth and protection. "We're going to take care of you," she whispered, her voice firm with determination. "Both of you. We're going to keep you safe." The dog let out a soft huff, his eyes drifting shut as his body relaxed, his trust complete. And for the first time since the night began, Emma felt hope. The storm outside continued to rage, the wind howling through the trees, snow piling high against the cabin walls. But inside, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the love of her family, Willow slept peacefully, safe in the embrace of her guardian. And Emma knew, without a doubt, that they would face whatever came next together. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and tender moments, a delicate dance of survival and love. Willow grew stronger, her tiny body warming beneath the careful watch of her golden guardian. Maximum. That was the name Emma chose for him, a name that meant greatest, because no other word could capture the depth of his courage and loyalty. He never left Willow's side, not even for a moment, his golden fur a constant source of comfort and protection. Whenever Willow whimpered, Max would nuzzle her, his tongue flicking out to soothe her cries. When she grew restless, his paw would press gently against her back, holding her close, anchoring her in a world that had turned upside down. It was as if he understood that he was all she had now, and he accepted that responsibility with a quiet dignity that brought tears to Emma's eyes every time she watched them together. Michael built a makeshift pen near the fireplace, lining it with soft blankets and pillows to keep Willow warm. He brought in heating pads and stuffed animals, anything that could mimic the softness of her mother's fur. But Willow always sought Max. She would burrow against his belly, curling into the curve of his body, her tiny paws gripping his fur as if she were afraid he would disappear. Max would sigh softly, his eyes closing as he rested his head over her, his breath warm and steady, a lullaby that seemed to ease her fears. Emma spent hours by their side, watching Max's unwavering devotion, her heart swelling with admiration and love. She spoke to him softly, her fingers stroking his fur as she whispered words of gratitude. "You saved her," she would murmur, her voice breaking. "You saved her because you couldn't let her go. You're a hero, Max." Max's eyes would lift to meet hers, and in those golden depths, Emma saw an old soul, wise and gentle, a spirit touched by loss but strengthened by love. He would nuzzle her hand, his gaze softening, his tail wagging just slightly, as if to tell her he understood. He was healing too. They were all healing, together. But not everything was easy. Willow was fragile, her cries weak and trembling, her tiny body quaking with cold, even in the warmth of the cabin. She had nightmares, her limbs twitching as she whimpered in her sleep, her face scrunched in fear. Max would wake instantly, his body curling tighter around her, his nose pressed to her forehead, his low whine vibrating through her small frame. It always seemed to calm her, his presence like a balm that soothed her tiny, wounded heart. But each night, as the wind howled outside and the shadows danced along the walls, Emma wondered if they were doing enough, if love alone could truly save Willow. Michael worried too, his face drawn with exhaustion as he sat up late, reading every book on wildlife care he could find. He spoke with Dr. Harris daily, asking about feeding schedules, warmth requirements, anything that could help them keep Willow alive. Sarah cooked special formula, warming it carefully before feeding Willow from a tiny bottle, her hands trembling as she coaxed the cub to drink. "Come on, sweetheart," she would whisper, her voice thick with worry. "Just a little more. You need to be strong." Emma watched her parents struggle, saw the lines of fear etched into their faces, but she also saw hope. They were fighting for Willow, for Max, for the love that had entered their lives so unexpectedly, and they were stronger for it. They were a family. Max seemed to sense their efforts, his eyes lingering on them with quiet gratitude as they worked to care for Willow. He followed them everywhere, his body never far from the cub, his loyalty unwavering. He trusted them, and in return, they trusted him. He became a part of their lives, their home, their hearts. Emma took him on walks through the woods, letting him stretch his legs as she explored the snowy trails around the cabin. Max moved cautiously, his ears perked, his head turning at every sound, always alert, always protective. But when he looked at Emma, his eyes softened, his body relaxing as if he knew he was safe with her. She spoke to him constantly, telling him stories, sharing her dreams, her fears, her hopes for the future. "We're going to protect her, Max," she would promise, her voice firm with conviction. "We're going to give her a good life, a happy life." Max would wag his tail, his eyes shining with faith, his body pressing against her leg as if to say he believed her. It gave Emma strength, that trust, that unspoken bond between them. It made her believe they could truly save Willow. Days turned into weeks, and Willow grew stronger. Her eyes opened wide, curious and bright, taking in the world with innocent wonder. She learned to walk, her legs wobbling as she stumbled across the floor, her tiny claws scraping against the wood. Max was always beside her, his nose nudging her back to her feet whenever she fell, his body blocking her from any danger. He was patient, gentle, his movements slow and deliberate as he taught her how to navigate her new world. Emma watched them with awe, her heart aching with love. They were a pair, bound together by fate, by loss, by love. She knew that Max was more than just a protector. He was a father. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Willow took her first steps outside. She wobbled uncertainly at the threshold, her eyes wide as she looked out at the snow-covered ground. Max was beside her, his body tense with anticipation, his tail wagging slowly as he watched her take that first brave step. She squeaked in surprise as her paw sank into the snow, her body wobbling as she tried to balance. Max leaned down, his nose brushing her side, his eyes glowing with encouragement. Willow looked up at him, her tiny face scrunched in determination, and she took another step, then another, her paws sinking into the snow, her body shivering from the cold. But she kept going, her tiny form moving steadily forward, her courage carrying her into the world. Emma stood on the porch, her eyes wet with tears as she watched them together. Max's body shadowing Willow, his presence a constant shield. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a hope so fierce it took her breath away. They were going to be okay. They were going to make it. Max looked back at her then, his eyes meeting hers, his face softening as his tail wagged in slow, joyful sweeps. He understood. He knew that she had saved him too, that she had given him purpose, a family, a home. And Emma knew that she was the lucky one, to have witnessed this miracle, to have been a part of this story. She whispered a silent prayer of thanks, her heart full as she watched Max and Willow explore the snow, their figures framed by the golden light of the setting sun. Together they were unstoppable. Together they were family. Spring arrived in a burst of color and light, melting the snow that had once blanketed the forest in white. The air was sweet with the scent of blooming wildflowers, the sun warm and golden as it filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground below. Willow was no longer a tiny trembling cub, but a spirited ball of energy, her limbs strong and agile as she bounded through the clearing behind the Thompson cabin. Her fur had grown thick and glossy, her eyes bright with curiosity and mischief. She was beautiful, powerful, a little force of nature, and she was happy. Watching her play, Emma felt a swell of pride and love so intense it made her chest ache. Willow had grown so much, become so vibrant, so alive, and yet she was still the same sweet cub who had burrowed into Max's fur that first night, trembling and fragile, seeking warmth and safety. That bond had never changed. Max was always by her side, his golden coat gleaming in the sunlight as he chased after her, his tail wagging, his eyes sparkling with joy. They were inseparable, their connection unbreakable, a guardian and his charge, a father and his daughter. Emma watched them from the porch, her chin resting on her knees, her heart full as she saw Max let Willow tackle him, her small body wrestling playfully with his as she gnawed at his ear, her tiny growls fierce and determined. Max let out an exaggerated yelp, rolling onto his back, his paws flailing as he played along, his face the picture of mock surrender. Willow's victory roar was high-pitched and adorable, her eyes gleaming with triumph as she climbed onto Max's belly, her head held high. Max gave her a gentle nudge with his nose, his eyes soft with affection, his tail sweeping the ground. Emma laughed, the sound bright and musical, echoing through the clearing. It was a scene of pure happiness, of love and family, and she wanted to freeze this moment forever. But even as she smiled, a shadow passed over her heart, a whisper of fear that she could not ignore. Willow was growing up, and soon she would have to leave. The thought tightened Emma's throat, tears stinging her eyes. She had always known it would come to this. Willow was a wild creature, born to roam the forest, to climb the mountains, to live free. She could not stay here, confined by walls and fences, no matter how much they loved her. It would be selfish, cruel even, to keep her from her destiny. But the thought of saying goodbye... Emma hugged her knees tighter, her shoulders hunching as she tried to hold back a sob. How could she let go? How could she say goodbye to the little cub who had changed her life, who had taught her so much about love and courage? And Max, how could he possibly understand? He had lost so much already. How could she ask him to lose Willow too? A warm nose nudged her arm, and Emma looked up to find Max standing beside her, his eyes searching hers with a gentle wisdom that made her heart ache. He understood. Of course he did. Max had always known. From the moment he'd watched Willow take her first steps in the snow, he had known this day would come, and yet he had stayed. He had loved her fiercely, fully, without hesitation, even knowing he would one day have to let her go. That was Max's gift, his boundless heart, his ability to love without fear, without selfishness. It was the greatest lesson he had taught her. That love meant giving, even when it hurt, even when it meant saying goodbye. Emma wrapped her arms around Max's neck, burying her face in his fur as the tears finally came. "Oh, Max," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to let her go." Max whined softly, his tongue brushing against her cheek, his body pressing closer as if to lend her his strength. She felt his heartbeat beneath her fingers, strong and steady, a rhythm of life and love that had carried them all through the darkest of days. "You're right," she murmured, her voice trembling. "We have to do this." For her, she looked up, her gaze finding Willow as she tumbled through the grass, her laughter echoing through the clearing, so full of light and joy. She was ready. She was meant for this world, for this freedom, for this life. It was time to set her free. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the sky a brilliant shade of blue, the air crisp and sweet with the scent of pine. Emma stood at the edge of the clearing, her hands clenched at her sides as she watched Willow play. Max was beside her, his body tense, his eyes never leaving Willow. He knew, he understood, but his heart was breaking too. Emma took a deep breath, her shoulders shaking as she called out, "Willow! Come here, girl!" Willow's head snapped up, her ears perking as she bounded over, her body full of excitement, her eyes bright with love. She nudged Emma's hand, licking her fingers as she chuffed softly, her version of a purr. Emma's throat tightened, tears stinging her eyes as she knelt beside her, wrapping her arms around Willow's neck, her face pressing into the soft fur. "You're going to be amazing out there," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're going to be so strong, so brave. I'm so proud of you." Willow licked her cheek, a soft whimper escaping her lips as if she understood, as if she knew this was goodbye. Emma pulled back, her hands trembling as she looked into Willow's eyes, memorizing every detail, every fleck of gold. "You're ready," she said, her voice firm even as her heart shattered. "Go on, Willow. Go find your place in the world." Willow looked at her for a long moment, her eyes deep and searching. Then she turned, her body moving gracefully as she loped toward the trees, her head held high, her spirit free. She paused at the edge of the forest, her body turning to look back one last time. Max took a step forward, his body trembling, his eyes locked on hers. She let out a soft growl, a playful challenge, her tail flicking before she disappeared into the shadows. The clearing was silent, empty, the world seeming to hold its breath. Max sat down slowly, his head lowering, his shoulders sagging as the weight of the moment settled over him. Emma knelt beside him, her arms wrapping around his body, her tears wetting his fur. "She'll come back," she whispered, her voice trembling. "She'll come back to visit. I know she will." Max's body leaned into hers, his head lifting to gaze at the forest, his eyes filled with hope. And as the sun rose higher, bathing the clearing in golden light, Emma felt it too, a promise carried on the breeze, a whisper of love that would never fade. Willow was free, and she would always come home. This story is a powerful reminder of the bonds that transcend species, showing us that love and loyalty are not limited by blood or even by the boundaries of nature. Max's unwavering devotion and courage teach us about the true meaning of family, one that is built not just by birth, but by choice, by sacrifice, and by the promise to protect and love, no matter the cost. Through his example, we learn that letting go can be the ultimate act of love, a gift of freedom and trust. And Willow's journey from helpless cub to majestic creature of the wild reminds us of the importance of courage, growth, and finding our place in the world. This story isn't just about survival, it's about hope, healing, and the unbreakable bonds that connect us all. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with others who need a reminder of the power of love and loyalty, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful tales to life. See you in the next one.